Welcome back, class. We're going to dive into this third segment. And we're going to talk for a few minutes about the Hershey-Blanchard approach. And this one's going to be, as I mentioned earlier, a little more focused on the decision-making process of the leader. And leadership is just, and we've talked about it in one of the early chapters, it's all about making decisions. That's why you're earning the big bucks. That's why you sit in the big chair. That's why you have the opulent office. But at the end of the day, that's why you're there. Somebody within the organization has decided that you have the skill set and the knowledge and the expertise to be a leader in any given organization, and you have something to provide when it comes to leading a team. And that something that you provide is your ability to make the decisions that increases productivity, increases efficiency, increases return on investment. It doesn't matter what the goal or vision is. Somebody in the company has made the decision that you have what it takes to move the company, the organization forward. And so Hershey-Blanchard approach, they've developed, it's kind of it's not a decision tree. It's almost a continuum, like a leadership continuum. And it goes from directive to consultative to facilitative to delegative. And what did I say earlier in this text? A lot of this is rehash and rebrand. And where have we heard or where have we read, even since the start of this class, something kind of along those lines? If you go back to chapter 2, I think it was, we talked about decision making. We talked about autocratic. We talked about consultative, precipitative, and that kind of a facilitative and precipitative went together. And then we talked about delegate. So we've already talked about 4 types of decision-making processes earlier in one of the earlier chapters, and now we're going to see it in maybe a different approach, but at least it's going to be laid out a little differently. And again, what it's as we talked about earlier, being a leader, for the most part, it's about control. It's about that who controls the decision-making process. And we've already talked about earlier in some of the other chapters, sometimes you have to give up control to gain control or to hold on to control. And so it goes from the directive to the consultative, and then they talk about the demarcation of control. And so when you're up here in this directive and consultative area, you've got the leader still in control. I mean, the leader is rolling along. Again, directing everything. It's their way, and they're providing. Here's exactly the way I want to do it. Consultative, they start to give up a little control. They're consulting with their teams and providing some direction. And then you get into the facilitative, and you're definitely starting to lose control because you're giving your team more voice. And then if you get to the point where it's delegative, you've actually given your followers, you've given them a lot of freedom because you're just delegating. It's you walk into a team meeting and said, okay, team, here's where we are. We're at point A, we need to be at point B. And I'm going to give you the opportunity to lay out everything, develop the strategy, and determine how we're going to get from point A to point B. And I think it's important in this type of the Hershey-Blanchard approach to actually understand that as you're going down from the directive to the consultative, and between the consultative and the facilitative, you do hit that demarcation of control. And as the leader, you're starting to lose that control. And hopefully you've got a team that you are comfortable enough with and you are confident enough in that you don't mind giving up that control. And fortunately, in most of my leadership positions, I've either inherited a team that I'm comfortable with, or I've been able to mentor and train and educate a team to get them to the point that I'm comfortable with. So I think that's where you're going to have to determine how to function as a leader. Do you have a team that you don't think can make it? Or do you have a team that you're somewhat comfortable with? Or do you have a team that, you know, it's great, and you say, hey, I can just hand off everything? And I think that's where you're going to kind of move down that continuum. And when you get to that demarcation of control, you're going to have to decide at that point what you're going to do. And they go into detail about this approach. It applies to a single follower or an entire team. And then I agree. You can have one person that maybe a rock star that, you know, you delegate everything to, or you may have individuals that, you know, one or two individuals, maybe in that out group, maybe they're new, you know, followers, and you're, you know, in the directive area all the time. Decision making is all about control versus giving up control. And we've harped on that a couple of times in some of the earlier chapters. And then they say the demarcation of control, and it shifts from the leaders to the followers. And as you as a leader, you've got to be comfortable with that crossing over that demarcation of control. And followers on your team have to be comfortable with accepting responsibility and accepting accountability as you move across that demarcation of control. And they go into kind of where the leaders feel like they are before they hit that demarcation. Here's where they are before and the demarcation, and then after. When they're in the directive area, it's usually crisis, it's stressful, it's ambiguous, it's, you know, it's new employees. And especially from my perspective, even if you don't have a team that you feel comfortable in handing off to, a lot of times, even with highly skilled individuals or with teams that you feel very comfortable with, you still may be up here in this directive area if it's crisis situation, if it's crunch time, and it's not out of ordinary. And I've had it happen to me on a multitude of occasions. Get a call from somebody in senior management, you know, 8 o'clock on Friday night, or they send you an email and say, oh my God, I forgot. I've got to have this grant ready to roll on, you know, noon on Monday, or I've got to have a document put together that I can share with a hospital on Monday morning at, you know, a 9 o'clock meeting. And you as a leader, now you're hung. You know, how are you going to get from point A to point B, you know, at 8 o'clock on Friday night, knowing that you had to perform on Monday morning? And at those situations, it doesn't matter how great your team is. You may have to reach out and provide them direction on what you need them to do. Consultative, they say it's, you know, very popular among leaders. They're walking a fine line between control and shifting control. And remember, the demarcation of control is somewhere in that no man's land between consultative and facilitative. And so that's one way that leaders, they like to provide followers with the perception that they're gaining some control, yet the leaders still haven't given up control. They're still working as in the consultant type position, still functioning as a true consultant. And so they still have control, even though the followers can say, man, I'm starting to get some additional control, and it's great. So that's why I think it's popular with a lot of leaders. Leaders are still accountable, responsible, even in the facilitative and delegative styles. And that is a true statement. It doesn't matter how much control you're willing to offload to your followers. At the end of the day, the buck stops here. And I had I guess it was like a framed document that when I worked at the Economic Research Service in DC, I bought at the Bureau of Printing and Engraving. And it was one of these things and it said, the buck stops here. And I bought it. And as I started moving into leadership roles, I always kept, there were two things I kept in my office. I kept the sign that says the buck stops here. And the other thing I had a printout that my major professor at Ohio State gave me, and it said KISS. You know what KISS stands for? Keep it simple, stupid. And that was when I was writing my dissertation. And, then most graduate students try to get really creative. And I can remember my major professor on my dissertation committee, he finally came in one day and he had the thing framed, and he brought a hammer and nail in and nailed it on the wall and hung it up. And he said, "You see that?" He said, "I want you to think about that every time you're trying to write your dissertation." And I'm sitting there looking at it, and I'm thinking, what in the world is KISS? And he could tell I had a weird look on my face, and he said, "This is a very academic terminology." And he was really serious. And I'm thinking, what's he talking about? And he finally started laughing. He said, "It means keep it simple, stupid." And I never did forget that. And those were two things that I always remembered. The buck stops here. Keep it simple, stupid. And as a leader, whether you're a follower or a leader, I think that's good advice as you're working. Again, going back to managing up, managing sideways, your leadership approaches on these three approaches, that if you keep it simple, and it's easier for everybody to understand, the leader and the followers. Followers' readiness and context are key in the decision-making style. And again, it goes back to, is it crunch time? Is it something that you've got, some leeway, especially with your individuals that want to develop their leadership skills? Maybe you're more facilitative and delegative if you've got some time to work with. But if it's crunch time and crisis time, maybe you revert back to the consultative and the directive approach. So I think context and the time horizon impacts it a lot. And it goes that they had one other, or actually had a couple of other, I guess, tables, I'll call them. Even they weren't really Excel tables. They were more like Word tables. And they were talking about the leadership style, and under the directive style, the follower readiness level was 1. Lack of ability and confidence. We've talked about that in the past. Consultative, it's level 2. Lack of ability, but confidence and motivation. So individuals, again, go back to my MBA example. Man, they were gung-ho and they had all the confidence in the world, but they didn't have the ability. They didn't have the knowledge, the ability, the expertise. So that's why I spent all my time in consultative. Facilitative, it's level 3. Strong ability, but they lack confidence. And I had an individual when I worked at Blue Cross Blue Shield. The individual was really introverted, fresh out of school, didn't have a lot of confidence, really introverted, trying to get anything out of him other than yes or no, or sometimes just a grunt. And I can remember interviewing him, and I'm thinking, this is one of the smartest kids I've ever interviewed. I mean, you could tell. You could give him any question, and he wasn't really verbose. I mean, you weren't going to get a lot of words out of him, but you could tell he knew exactly what you were talking about. And I decided to hire him against most of the direction I got from my managers at that time. But you got him in and worked with him, and you could tell he started writing computer programs, and he was doing linear regression, and he was just knocking it out of the park. And the kid could program, and he was just one of the best followers, one of the best associates we had. And he finally started coming out of his shell. Sometimes you have those individuals, you have to facilitate them and work with them because they have that strong ability, but they just lack the confidence. And I could see it in him. And I think you've all had, individuals like that, or as a follower, you've seen individuals on a team that they're just introverted and they're not very friendly, and they want to sit off in a corner and, not interact in team meetings and things. And yet at the same time, they really have a skill set that is going to be extremely valuable to the organization of the team. And then lastly, the delegative, it's level 4. They're highly ready to handle problems. And these are the type of individuals that, you've heard the term, rocket in the pocket. They are just, they're rock stars in the making, and that they're not going to be on your team very long, because they're just moving up the corporate ladder, and you can just see the potential. And those are the ones that you want to delegate to. You want them to spread their wings, and you want them to knock it out of the park, and you're there for support. But they're also the kind of individuals you don't have to worry about supporting much. You can walk into them and say, we're at point A, we need to get to point B, figure out how to do it, come to me when you have the answer. And then lastly, on the delegative, you're talking about responsibility, ownership, accountability, and that's at level 4 kind of individual. And those are the kind of individuals that you want others to emulate with on the teams. And as they see you giving them responsibility and giving them some latitude to make decisions, you will actually find individuals that you might not have thought would ever make it to level 4. You see them start to migrate toward that level 4, to migrate. They're looking at these individuals as role models, and you see them start to develop some of the skills and some of the same expertise. So it's great to see that happen. And on the delegating side, there's a couple, 3 or 4 reasons why you delegate. One might be needed to assess promotion possibilities, because you've always got, corporations, at least ones I've worked in, where it comes to middle management, there's a lot of promotion opportunities up to like the vice president level. So team leads, supervisors, managers, directors, executive directors, a lot of that middle management, there's a lot of promotion opportunities. And then you're asking yourself the questions: do the levels indicate raise, bonus, or other benefits? That's something you as a leader have to determine there. Do the levels indicate they're going to be more in that exceeds, meets the goals, exceeds the goals, stretch goals? I would argue that level 1 is going to be more in the meets goal. Level 2 and 3, they're starting into that exceeds the goals. They may, on some of the goals, hit that stretch goal. But if you're you have employees or followers in that level 4, I'm expecting them to be in that stretch goal realm all of the time, because they have the capability. And as long as you can keep them motivated and mentoring, they're going to do a really good job for you. And then they talk about the fluidity of it, how different styles of leadership might be shown to the same followers in different decision-making situations, and even in some situations over time. And again, it's the fluidity. They're talking about context, crunch time, crisis, over the weekend, new employees, or do you have like a month to put together a strategy together? Especially if you're in November and December, and you're trying to come up with goals and visions for the next year. You've got plenty of time at that point, so you may want to offload and delegate some of this to teams and say, hey, come up with our vision. What do you think our goals should be? You think our goals should be linear, or do you think they should be some other combination to get from point A to point B for us? So I think the context, and again, time horizon, I can't stress time horizon enough, because that's going to drive a lot of your decisions. And as I mentioned earlier, some followers might get confused, and they might not appreciate fluidity. They might have a real problem with being directive sometime and delegated to another, and consultative and facilitated. And they have a hard time getting their arms around what your leadership style is. And because they've never been in a leadership role or had that opportunity, they have a really hard time getting their arms around what it takes to be a good leader, and what you expect of them, and how your leadership style can change over time. And that's going to wrap it up on this particular approach on your situational leadership. And when you come back, we're going to talk about the Vroom, and I think it's pronounced Jago, approach. Talk to everybody again in a few minutes. Thank you.